I'm going to do 2 chapters here in 45 minutes. This will be a short lecture, but it's going to cover a lot of things, so pay attention. There's a lot of things going on here. First and foremost, we got chapter 7, which has to do with developing nations. I already set this up for you in the previous lecture a little bit. What I said was economies tend to grow slow, but people don't like slow growth. They want rapid growth. So a lot of countries opt for shortcuts, and those shortcuts tend to backfire. So there's 3 of them. Cartels, don't worry about all this other stuff. Cartels, import substitution, and export-led growth. The thing about these 3 strategies, they seem to be related to regions of the planet. So certain regions tend to keep doing one of these, certain regions keep doing another, and they kind of keep going back to that well. I don't know if it's a national or a cultural thing or what, but it just seems to be the case that these are associated with the region. So the first thing is to form a cartel. As you learned in principles, in oligopoly settings, when you have a few firms with market power, what they can do is collude and form a de facto monopoly, a cartel. A cartel is when multiple producers get together and act as a single producer. And if you're a single producer, you can restrict production and raise prices, and that enriches those in the group. Middle Eastern countries have a large portion of the world's oil reserves, and once they nationalized those early in the last century, the governments formed a cartel called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It includes a few other countries, not just Middle Eastern countries, but OPEC controls a fairly large portion of the global oil market, and their idea is to do just that, is to restrict production and keep oil prices high. Sometimes this succeeds, sometimes it doesn't. The problems that you run into with this is that, yes, this will enrich in those countries, but adding money to poor countries does not necessarily translate into a higher standard of living for people, especially if all of that money is just concentrated at the top, where the royal families of these Middle Eastern countries, like the Saud royal family, probably should be recording this, the Saud royal family controls all the money. They're super wealthy, but the average Saudi Arabian is not necessarily doing that well. Same thing in Iraq. In Iraq, which we talked about earlier, in the 1990s, Saddam Hussein had all kinds of money because he controlled the oil. He was part of that cartel. But the average lot of the people was not a very high standard of living. It was some form of poetic justice that when we finally caught Saddam Hussein after the Second Gulf War, he was hiding in a mud hut of a peasant in his own country. And it was his own squandering of that nation's wealth and their resources to enrich in himself that had led to this low standard of living for the people. So why do we want economic growth? Well, around the world you have developed countries like the United States. We're almost a post-developed country. We're extremely high in our standard of living. We've gone through a lot of economic growth. We've had the institutions, we've had the structure that is, and the work ethic, whatever you want to give credit to, American exceptionalism, call it whatever you want. We've just won. We're number one. We've got the world's largest economy. We're only 5% of the world's population. And it's not even close. Our standard of living is extremely high in this country as a result. There's other countries that are developing. They're on their way to where we are, but they're not quite there yet. So you got Western nations, the developed countries, and then you've got these developing nations that are trying to get to where we are, but they're not there yet, and they have a lower standard of living. Then you have underdeveloped countries and, sadly, the least developed countries, and those people are living in abject poverty. We talk about poverty in the U.S. Our poverty and their poverty are 2 different things. When I was in Nepal, I was asking a bartender there, not that I talk to a lot of bartenders, but they do like to talk. Or they don't like to, they will talk to you, I guess that's the point. And I asked him how much, it's like I don't want to be too personal here. I'm going to tell everybody I meet what you answer to me, so this isn't private conversation, but what do you make? He's like, he told me in rupees, and I did the math. It's like, $5 an hour? That's pretty good. He's like, no, $5 a day. I was like, oh, and he'd been working all day. He was in there early in the morning. He was working late at night. So we're talking, a 12-hour work day, making $5 a day. And that was considered a really good job. And I was like, wow. I was making $5 an hour back in 1978, mowing a lawn. I mean, come on, are you kidding me? For 30 minutes. I was making $10 an hour, so it only took me 30 minutes to mow the lawn for $5. I mean, that's crazy. And these are underdeveloped countries. And so what you want is for them to grow, but you get these cartels like you have in the Middle East, and they squander the wealth. These cartels also cause a lot of conflict. It's very difficult to maintain that cartel, so you have a lot of infighting. I mentioned a lot of the violence that you see in the Middle East now is not them against us, it's them against them. And they're fighting over control of the oil resources because there's so much wealth to be had. So it creates these bad incentives, this fighting, and all those wars and everything. Iran and Iraq fought for 20 years. 20 years of warfare decimates economies. It just takes them out. And so there's a lot of problems with these cartels. Again, it's a shortcut that has a lot of reasons why. Import substitution. Oh, so again, the region cartels. Think Middle East. That's a good place to think. Import substitution is another form of shortcut where we see this one in South American countries. So associate this with South America regionally. And what's the deal with import substitution? Basically, what you have there is a strategy where they say, hey, instead of importing expensive things from other countries that they need, like cars and stuff like that, let's make them here. Well, the problem is they don't have a comparative advantage in all of those things that they import. They have a comparative advantage, say, in Brazil, exporting timber because of the rainforest that they sit on there. So they have a lot of these primary resources that they can export. But the problem is, over time, the prices of those timber exports have been falling, whereas the price of a new car has been getting higher and higher. And that means the terms of trade have been deteriorating. So they say, well, wait a second, we need to reverse this. We need to make cars and export those. But to do that, they have to take resources away from their comparative advantage. And so the idea is what the strategy is basically like this. They say, okay, instead of buying cars from other countries, we're going to put up big tariffs. We're going to protect our domestic car production industry, and then we're going to make our own cars, and that's going to make us rich. But what do tariffs do? They don't help you, they hurt you. So it's basically a protectionist strategy, and it's called import substitution because they're trying to substitute domestic production for imports. But it works against comparative advantage. It continuously fails over and over and over again, but they keep going back to the well, which again is a really good definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But we've seen that a lot in South American countries. I expect to see it happen again in Brazil now. They're kind of having problems, and I expect to see them return to these protectionist policies. They can't seem to get away from them. Export-led growth, think Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, we've had a lot of success stories. Countries like South Korea, Japan, post-World War II, Japan came out of the ruins to become the world's fourth largest economy. I mean, they really stuck the landing. They did a really good job with economic growth and prosperity. And what they found was that they had this knack for making and exporting things. So what they started doing is they said, well, if exporting stuff is the key to growth, we need to export more and more and more. So let's subsidize the export industry. In the process, they kind of were restricting a lot of imports and just focusing on exports, and they were trying to create that favorable trade balance like we talked about with the mercantilists. That's been their strategy, and by heavily subsidizing the export industry and growing it, it's kind of like fertilizing a tree. A little bit of fertilizer goes a long way with a tree, right? The tree will grow fast if you put some fertilizer on it. So is the solution to making the tree grow faster and faster to keep putting more and more fertilizer on the roots? What'll happen if you over-fertilize a tree? You'll burn it up. It'll die. Guess what happened in Japan by over-subsidizing their export industry? They've had 30 years now of economic stagnation. They basically killed the roots. They've overdone it. Economies are not more about doing the good things. Economies are about a balance. Economies are a free market is let the market do it. If in Brazil, the best export that they can possibly do is timber, then export timber. Regardless of what that means in terms of prices and the terms of trade, it's the best you can do. Don't do too much of it, don't do too little of it. Do the right amount. It's like Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. Same thing for exports from Japan or South Korea or anywhere. There's an optimal number of exports that the markets will determine based on prices and the terms of trade and stuff like that. Just because a little is good doesn't mean a lot is better. Or in some cases, if more is better, it's not always better and better. At some point, you want to kind of level it off. So We've seen that in Southeast Asian countries, export-led growth. I would argue that out of all of these, the one that stands the best chance of success would be export-led growth, because at least it's in the direction of comparative advantage. So if, in fact, Japan has the comparative advantage in the exportation of electronic devices, and they're coming out of a war when their industry is decimated, by subsidizing that, they caught up real quickly to where they should have been in the first place. But what's the key? Once you've caught up, what do you need to do? You need to stop subsidies. You can't just keep adding fertilizer. So it's like the tree lacked nutrients, and they put the fertilizer on with the subsidies to begin with, and that was their export-led growth initially, and then back off. But they kept going. They kept pushing it. And they basically overdid it. They've misallocated resources. They've done too much. They've overdeveloped an industry, which has come at the expense of other things in their economy. Okay, that's all you need to know for Chapter 7. See how quick that was? 11 minutes of Chapter 7. It's a personal record. So I can get it down to 10 minutes next semester. Okay, that brings us to the important topic. We've got about 30 minutes to go, so let's knock this out. Short order as well. In the news right now is the European Union and the problems it's having. This is a tricky lecture to give because, again, we've got a heavily politicized debate out there right now. In a nutshell, liberals, both in Europe, England, and the U.S., my sister is very, very liberal. She's all against exit. She has no dog in that fight, but just her political affiliation, being a Democrat, makes her take a particular side in this argument. Whereas my conservative friends are all about, no, man, they should have left. Well, I'm going to try to kind of give you a little bit of the backstory here, and what we might find is that both sides are kind of right and both sides are kind of wrong. There's a richer economic story going on there. And it all revolves around regional trade arrangements, which is what Chapter 8 is all about. And we don't know how this is going to play out yet. We'll see as it goes forward. According to the textbook, according to economists, regional trade arrangements like the European Union are, in theory, a really good idea. They promote a lot of economic growth. There's a couple of things, both static and dynamic effects, that you get out of these regional trade arrangements where countries band together and engage in more trade with one another. They reduce tariffs or eliminate tariffs altogether. They form customs unions and common markets. They allow for the free flow of labor between countries. All of these things, they even adopt similar laws and regulations, and then on top of that, they even use the same currency. All of those things promote economic efficiency. It's very difficult to have market transactions when you have all of these barriers resisting those economic transactions. At the end of the day, economic prosperity hinges on more economic transactions happening unfettered. So regional trade arrangements get rid of all of those barriers to a certain degree. As you increase the level of economic integration between the member countries, you reach higher and higher levels of economic efficiency. The problem is it becomes politically more and more challenging to move forward. So when you hear the people arguing that there are benefits to England being part of the European Union, that's the argument they're making. That that in theory, there are economic benefits to being part of these. And remember what I said, that part of being, it means the free flow of labor. It means forming a customs union where you have harmonized standards or tariffs, harmonized tariffs with the other countries. You have no trade barriers, no tariffs, things like that. Right away, you should see that there might be a political issue coming into play. When I talk about the free flow of labor, the mobility of people, the free mobility of people between the countries, why has that become, especially based on this weekend's event, why has that become, or this week's event, a huge political hot potato right now? What are they worried about? They're not worried about a French worker taking a job in Belgium. That's an economic gain for both that French worker and Belgium.
I guess, would it be them kind of having to say so for them, even though they don't They're not.
Well, who are they? Again, they're not worried about some French guy who speaks good English coming over.
About terrorism.
Yeah, they're worried about terrorism, aren't they? They're worried about safe and sound borders. But what does a regional trade arrangement do? It removes those border protections. And like I said, if you've been to Europe recently, you can get on a train and go anywhere you want in Europe. And if you're a terrorist, you can go anywhere you want in Europe. And what was England's response to that? Rightfully so. You're telling us we got to take terrorists over here? We don't want terrorists over here. Well, maybe that's overstating the case, but you see the fear. You see the problem there. And with the events that just happened in France, the terrorists who shot up all those people in France in the rock concert, they weren't from France. They'd come in from Belgium.
There wouldn't be some kind of policy that they could institute for them not to exit, but for them to hey, we can find some kind of common ground.
Well, it's two arguments, isn't it? There's the political issues and there's the economic issues. And so you want the economic benefits, but you don't want those political costs. And so what did England basically vote for? They said, hey, we still want to trade with you guys. We want all of those good things. But even though it is economically beneficial to have open labor markets, there's an overriding public interest argument that we can't be sure that the people who are coming in here are safe.
Could he mimic something like NAFTA?
Well, again, the more steps you take towards economic integration, the more economic benefits you get. So idealistically, you want to go that direction. And they want the perfect system. That's what the problem is, though, right? It's very difficult to form that perfect system. So we'll talk about those issues. It's only in times where these political arguments start to override the economic arguments that you start to see this fracturing like you're seeing now. And exactly the case. That's what my listening to the British leaders, like the United Kingdom Independence Party leader Nigel Farage, who's kind of a wingnut but funny as heck. He's been saying we still want to trade with we still want the economic benefits, but we're just concerned about some of these political issues. But then Europe's responding and saying, no, you can't cherry pick. You're either in or out. You're either part of the club or you're not. You got to believe everything we believe in or not. And so there's this sovereignty argument versus that. So again, both sides have a pretty legitimate argument depending on what your frame of reference is. And of course, each side is exaggerating the other side's evilness, right? So what are the exit people saying? You guys are socialist, bureaucrat, communists, and you want to overtake the sovereignty of our people, and this is conspiracy theory kind of stuff. And they're kind of trying to peddle those ideas. And then the people are saying, well, you guys are just stupid and don't understand all this. But they do understand the economics. They understand the benefits, but they're more concerned about the costs. It's just a difference of frame of reference. But it becomes ad hominem, right? Attack the other people. You're stupid, you're communists, right? That becomes the debate. And that's completely unproductive. And what's it going to lead to? Like you said, can't they just do something like NAFTA? Can't they just do a free trade area?
But we still have borders.
Right. But do we?
Better than they do, apparently.
Well, on paper we do. But what about, the economics and politics always are at odds. Even when you pass laws saying Mexican workers can't come into our country to work, the economics says so. There's still an economic incentive to cross the border. We'll talk about that more later and see why that is. So we have porous borders with laws that say we're not supposed to have them. So again, these are issues that they're political in nature. And is there an effective policy to really protect the border in the first place? And if you're really not going to keep the terrorists out anyways, then why not just go ahead and get the economic benefits? If there's an effective government policy to completely control a border, you can do that. It's just very expensive to completely protect a border. It does literally take building a wall. And not just building a wall, but what do you got to do with that wall? You got to man it. Yeah, you got to put a lot of people on it.
But aren't the countries in the European Union a lot more closely similar economic-wise than us and Mexico, though? So there would be an influx of Mexican workers coming in, or French workers to England or West
They got the same issues. They have a lot of...
Is that gap the same between us and Mexico?
Yeah, when you start talking about Middle East. And
I was talking about just the European Union.
Yeah, but see, Turkey's getting in on it.
Okay. So
now you've got that conduit where they're going to have that cultural tension as well. So, and again, that kind of being in the works. All of a sudden, that you see where the opposition is coming from in England. It's saying, if you're going to just kind of keep expanding this thing, we can't guarantee our safety. And that's kind of a rough argument right now. That's kind of a real heated political argument because it becomes culturally insensitive and all this kind of stuff. So we want to kind of stay away from that. What I'm going to tell you about is, yes, those politics are there and they cause problems with doing this. In theory, if you do these correctly and you control your external borders within the group, then you're fine. That may be, in practical terms, that may be impossible. But in theory, this is what we're talking about. This is where these are the economic benefits to being more economically integrated. And you start with a partial trade agreement. You do just a simple, let's get rid of some tariffs on these things, and you get rid of your tariffs on those things. And what does that do? It creates more trade. So you have more economic benefits from more trade, and you get more competition, and competition is good. Markets are good for two reasons. Competition is good for two reasons. Competition does two things. One, it keeps prices in check. Without competition, you get monopolies, and they raise prices, and that means consumers lose economic well-being because they can't afford to buy some of the stuff, at the margin at least. Actually, everybody buys less at lower prices, so you end up going without when you don't have competition. So competition keeps prices in check and creates maximum economic efficiency in that respect. Competition also does something more important, I would argue, which is it forces innovation. As long as you have two competing companies, you got to keep building a better mousetrap. Otherwise, if you just had one, you can make the same thing, never innovate, and it doesn't get you anywhere. So the U.S. Postal Service is a good example. They never had any competition. They're doing the same thing now, delivering junk mail to every single American household 6 days a week that they did 50 years ago. And the only reason they ever did anything innovative in parcel delivery is because FedEx and American Express provided competition, and they couldn't just take 20 days to get something to you anymore. They had to start competing, and they had to innovate, figure out quicker ways to get things to people. They had to do the same tracking services. They never had tracking services, and they don't on mail. You don't get tracking services on mail. You just get it, unless you go through all this rigmarole with registering the mail and that kind of stuff. You get it on packages, and they had to do that to compete with FedEx and American Express. And why did FedEx first start doing that? Well, they were competing with UPS. I said American Express. FedEx and UPS. And that competition causes product innovation. What does that do for consumers to have competitive entities making better and better products? Remember the first cell phones? If there was only one cell phone company, this would still be one of those stupid flip phones. And to text somebody, what would you have to do? Hit the 9 button 3 times, and then the 2 button twice, and then the 3 button once just to spell some word. I don't know what I may have just spelled a dirty word. I don't know what I did. But because you had a couple of competing entities, Motorola, Apple, just rattle off all those names, as soon as they came out with iPhones were real small for a while, and then you had the really big, what's the big one? Android, Samsung phones. And what did the consumers say? Hey, we like them bigger. So what did Apple have to do? And make them bigger. So they're always that innovation always forces them to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. They would rather make them smaller because it's cheaper. You don't have to use as much stuff to make a small one. But they had to figure out ways of doing it. So they moved the production to China. And they're always doing that. So that's the important part of competition. When you remove trade barriers, you increase competition. You get a check on prices, and you get more competition and more innovation. We call that innovation and competition dynamic effects, whereas the increased trade is a static effect. There can be some negative economic consequences, but called trade diversion, but it's usually overwhelmed by the positive stuff. So on net, you see that forming a partial trade agreement is better than not having a partial trade agreement. The next step is to do a free trade area. This is like NAFTA between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And NAFTA was us, our region, North America, 3 countries coming together and agreeing not to have tariffs against one another. This happened in 92. This was enacted, 93 maybe. NAFTA was enacted. And since then, it's created a lot of trade between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. At the time, the president of Mexico, when we were ratifying NAFTA, the president of Mexico wanted to make North America a common market, which is 2 steps from now, and that would allow the free flow of labor, all right, that like they have in Europe. He was wanting to take another step. And why is that important for Mexico? Well, obviously, a lot of Mexican workers like to come to the U.S., more so than maybe than U.S. workers like to go to Mexico. So they had an interest in opening up that border, whereas we argued, no, we want to protect that border. The markets don't care what your skin color is so much. If it's in a competitive market, they don't care what your nationality is or your culture is. Markets care about your money. Markets care about efficiency. And it's actually efficient if you have an excess supply of labor in one area and a demand for that labor somewhere else. It's economically efficient if that supply meets that demand. But what if you put a border in between there? And what is a border? I mean, think about what a border is. It's literally an invisible line that does not exist except for on paper. We draw this line between 2 nations. The economics are still the economics, whether you put 2 lines in there or 3. I'll give you an example. When I took the job here, there was a demand for professors in Georgia. Basically, the Hope Scholarship created this huge demand for professors. In South Carolina, higher education was kind of not doing so well, so there was a surplus of professors. There was excess professors up in South Carolina. And so I went on the job market, and guess what the economics made me do? Move to Georgia. And in the process, I crossed over probably no fewer than 30 or 40 political borders. There was a big one between South Carolina and Georgia, and there was a bunch of city and county borders that I had to cross over. All these are invisible lines, jurisdictions. And whether it's a city border, a county border, a state border, or a national border, they're all invisible lines, and the same process holds true. Matter of fact, there weren't enough of us in South Carolina, so where else did we bring them in from? We had some that crossed the Mexican border. Francisco Lopez came in from Mexico. He's Spanish, but he was living in Mexico. So he came across that border. Simone Phillips, she's from the islands. She's from Trinidad and Tobago. So she crossed a bunch of borders. She couldn't walk over them. She had to fly. Water. Anthony Narsing came in from Canada. He crossed some borders there. Again, the economics don't care about those invisible lines. Politically, we care about those lines. But the economics, it's more efficient because if you restrict the free flow of that labor, then you end up with unemployed professors in South Carolina and Canada and Trinidad and Tobago, and you end up with students with no one to teach them in Georgia. And there's no economic gains to be had there. So that flow of labor is obvious in terms of the economics. Now, if I come in and blow up the World Trade Center instead of take a job here, that's obviously a bad thing. But those are 2 different things. The majority of people crossing borders are not coming over here to blow up our buildings. If you take Mexican workers coming into this country, typically they're building our buildings, not blowing them up. They're coming for construction jobs, they're coming for restaurant jobs, they're coming for other low-skilled jobs that most Americans don't want. And they have a surplus of workers. We have a shortage of workers willing to do those jobs. So it's just the market's solving that problem. That doesn't mean that you don't document them as they come in. It doesn't mean that you don't set up a system of immigration where you have visas and that they honor that system and don't break those laws illegally. What we'll find when we talk about immigration, though, in later chapters, the laws are kind of rigged against low-skilled workers. It's very expensive to get a green card, to become a documented permanent resident alien. It's very difficult to get that. And anything that's cheap to get expires after a year. And so when your temporary work visa, which you can afford to get, expires, you've come in legally, but then what do? You just stay. And then you've broken the law. Even though you're kind of just doing it, you don't have an incentive to spend $5,000 to get a green card, so you don't do that. And so there's areas for reform of that system because we do want tabs on people. We want to know who's here from where. We would like people to pay their fair share of taxes and that kind of stuff. And if they're operating under the table, we don't know that. So. A customs union takes everything a free trade area is and adds to it similar tariffs. So if you have a group of 3 countries, We're not a customs union. We can have a tariff against China, and Mexico under NAFTA does not have to agree with that. If we were a customs union, they'd have to have the same tariff. We'd have to harmonize that tariff. So again, this forces us to act as a unified body. Ideally, that means we get rid of other tariffs equally. Common markets allows for the free flow of labor. I just talked about that. That adds one more step to it. These kind of add on each other. You can think of these as becoming more and more economically integrated. The first ones are fairly easy to do. It still took us 10 years of talking about NAFTA to get there, and it's taken 25 years for the EU to get to where it's falling apart. But it never did fully get together. Common markets add for the free flow of the factors of production, in particular labor. Opens up labor markets. An economic union harmonizes rules and regulations and laws. If you think about it, if you've got a bunch of countries trading with one another and allowing companies to move across those borders and workers to move across those borders, but you have different laws, extremely different laws in every country, different regulations, such as different environmental regulations, it might make it difficult for a company to set up shop in a neighboring state. So you want to harmonize those, get those all on board. This is the part of the European Union that fell apart. They couldn't agree on common sets of laws because what does England have to do in terms of their own national sovereignty to sign on to such an agreement? Well, they got to give up that national sovereignty. They got to say, okay, we're going to let this supranational government dictate what we do. What did a lot of voters think about that in England last week? Yeah, we don't really like that step. And so they never made that step, even though other countries, and actually England never did the monetary union either. They were cherry picking to begin with because they wanted to maintain control of their own currency, and that was important to them, and it was actually fairly prescient because since they didn't have standardized rules and regulations on how to govern government borrowing behavior in particular, Greece got out of control and borrowed a bunch of money because they were all in the same currency with Germany and France. But England kept the British pound. So even though the euro is now shaky because of what Greece and Italy and Spain have done, England was smart to say, we're going to cherry pick, we're going to keep our own currency, and we're going to keep our currency strong. And we're not going to jump into the pool with you guys when it comes to that. So they've always been a little bit on the outside, and now the only things that they really agreed to were they were a free trade area and maybe the customs union part, but also a common market. And what they're rebelling against now is that common market was a little bit too much for them politically to take with the threat of terrorism and the political issues there. So basically, what are they doing? They want to fall back to just be a free trade area. That's kind of what they want to do. They want labor to be able to move in, but they probably want to keep closer tabs on it. But that's going to create an impediment, friction, in the markets that's going to actually hurt them economically. But why are they willing to pay those costs? Because they see the gains in national security to be worth that. At least the people who voted for it. Unless they're just total idiots and just kind of randomly picked a button on the polls, which some people do, I guess. So really, that's what the debate is. It's just how much do you value national security? Some people value it more than others. And some people are willing to give up the economic benefits of a common market to gain perceived control over the border. I say perceived because, again, it's always... If you want to keep people out of England, you got a long shoreline you got to protect. You know, it's just an island, and you can land a boat anywhere on that shoreline and get in if you want to. So are you really getting any more security? And what are terrorists going to do? Are they going to care about whether you have a policy that says they can't come in? No, they're just going to figure out a way to get in. May not be as easy for them. It may slow them down a little bit, but... So those are some of the arguments. Those are the ways to kind of think about what's going on in Brexit. Now, if they're completely isolated and shut off, it's going to be a big loss for them. If they can maintain a free trade area and have still some open markets in terms of labor, not make it too restrictive, they probably won't take as big a hit. But there are economic benefits to going forward. I'd give you an example of a monetary union that works as the United States of America. I may have mentioned this last class, but we're a de facto monetary union. We're 50 independent states plus a few territories. We're a free trade. You can't put a tariff against peaches from Florida to protect the Georgia peach market. That's illegal. We have interstate commerce laws that prevent you from doing tariffs against other states. So we are a free trade area. We are a customs union because if we have a tariff against China, all 50 states have to abide by it. We're a common market. I came in from Georgia to take this job. If I want to leave here and go to California, what's stopping me? Nothing. Just go get a job and move over there. I did have to swear allegiance to the Constitution of Georgia when I took this job. I bet that's something none of you have done. Have any of you sworn your allegiance to the Constitution of Georgia? Traitors. I'm a South Carolinian born, South Carolinian bred, Californian raised. And I'm more Georgian than you guys. I've been here for 15 years. We're an economic union. We have a federal government that governs our rules and regulations, like interstate commerce laws and things like that. We have a constitution to protect your civil liberties. You have the same court system. If you're doing business in California with someone and they violate a contract, you can take them to court and under the same judicial system and have that resolved. Again, if you were different countries, you'd have problems with doing all that. So you might not do business with California in the first place, and that would be a drain on the economy. Finally, we're a monetary union. We use one currency, and that works well for us because we have rules in place that keep Alabama from borrowing too much damn money, like Greece did. We have that economic union in place that that regulates the state's behavior. Our federal constitution governs what, the powers that we can do in each state and what, how things are done. So we have that, and as a result of being a textbook monetary union, we followed all the rules, we did everything right, basically. There's a few issues in there, but for the most part, we got it 99% right. We're the biggest economy on the planet. That's the proof of the economic benefits from this stuff. What was the European Union supposed to mimic? Us. They said, hey, we're a bunch of countries that collectively represent 25% of the global economy. Why don't we make it happen? Why don't we be one? But where are the political hurdles? Well, so forming that constitution. Again, we did that over 200 years ago in this country, and 240 years ago in this country, and it was difficult for us to get it done. I mean, people risked their lives to get that done in this country, and it was only 13 colonies who all had a lot in common at the time. Now you're talking European countries with all different languages, different cultures, a history of warfare with one another. I mean, think about that. Our 13 colonies never fought a war with one another. But Germany and France, being part of the same thing, they fought a few wars, a bunch. So, of course, the political element of this is going to be more difficult in Europe. And that's what we're seeing now, and it may cost them. It may cause the thing to completely fall apart. All right. Have a look at NAFTA. You can read that in textbook as well as I can talk about it, but it talks about the costs and benefits of NAFTA and how the benefits outweigh the costs. It's argued and probably pretty well documented that Mexico gained the most and the U.S. and Canada gained, but not as much as Mexico. And that's usually the case. They had the most to gain from doing it. But we both gained, and so did Canada. Canada may have gained the least because they were already pretty much trading with us a lot, so it didn't really do a whole lot more for them. The CMEA is the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. That was the former Soviet Union's trade bloc. It was not a real regional trade arrangement in the way we're talking about. It wasn't textbook. It was a political and contrived trade union based on this thing called countertrade, and countertrade is barter. It has nothing to do with free markets. All the stuff I talk about, supply and demand, meeting up, that's not what happened in the former Soviet Union. They just had political favors dictating the flow of resources, which means it may have been economically efficient, but likely was not. And so the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance or COMECON, is an example of a different type of regional trade arrangement that has nothing to do with economics, really. It's more a political deal, and it's based on barter, and it didn't work very well. Yeah, so you need some vodka for your party, so you say, hey, send us 3 million barrels of vodka, and you may not have any drinkers in your country, but so you would have that kind of stuff there. And we'll send you some ball bearings, because that's all we have. Who knows if that's what is needed to be traded or not. It was just a political favor.